Bienvenidos a su programa La Ciudad de las Ideas. Estamos aquí en el Instituto de Aspen, donde muchísima gente se reúne durante todo el año a hablar de distintas ideas. Y por supuesto, hoy tenemos una mente que no solamente es provocadora y que no solamente piensa sobre lo que hay que pensar, sino que es inventor. Ha hecho y ha roto paradigmas dentro de la computación y la tecnología. Y realmente es un honor tener una persona que además tan joven, aunque Einstein es muchacho todo el que tenga mi edad, a pesar de que es un poquito mayor que yo, es muy joven para lo que ha logrado. I'm talking that it's incredible that you're only 55 years old and all the things that you have done. So it's really a pleasure, es un verdadero placer tenerte, Tim, aquí en Debra. We will start like this. How would you introduce yourself? Who are you?
I guess I would say I'm somebody who's trying to make good futures happen. A lot of what my business has become is a business in which I watch interesting people and ideas emerging from the edges, often from people that you would call hackers or enthusiasts. And I think a lot about what it means, and then I tell a story about it, or I find other ways to help take that, what I see happening, and make it happen more widely. There's this great quote from the science fiction writer William Gibson. He said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." Wow. And so in some sense, the job of my business is to help distribute the future. So let me give you a couple of concrete examples. Back in the late 80s, we were part of a community that was starting to use the internet commercially. The internet had been a research network, and all of a sudden people were starting to push against the bounds of the idea that this should just be a research network, and there was this idea that maybe it could be commercial. And up through the early 90s there was a lot of pressure on this, and this really took off with the World Wide Web. Now, I published a book in 1992 called The Whole Internet User's Guide and Catalog. At the time we published the book, there were only 200 websites. But we could see, because we ourselves were part of that community, that those early adopters who were discovering this new technology and saying how amazing it was, we featured it prominently in the book, and we said this is the future. So a whole lot of people first were exposed to the World Wide Web from our book, and then we went on from there to actually launch the first commercial website. We got permission from the National Science Foundation to have a website that contained advertising, and Steve Wolf, who was the administrator at the time, said, the internet's is for research and education. If that's not what you guys are about, I don't know who is. So he kind of gave us the blessing, and that was kind of a beginning of the internet gold rush. And a number of years later, I realized that many of my best-selling books, about internet technologies, but also about other sort of underground programming technologies, weren't getting much attention. And in fact, in 1996, we published the second edition of a book called Programming Perl, Perl being an open source programming language. The first edition we published in 1991. In 1996, that book was one of the top 100 books in the Borders bookstore chain. And the buyer told me that, and I thought, wow, how odd is it that nobody in computer media or mainstream media is talking about this language? There's no company behind it. So I decided to organize a conference to bring that community together. And then I realized, wait a minute, all of my bestsellers are like that. They're about these underground topics. And that was when I started to formulate this idea that what our business was bringing attention to these things that were happening, below the radar. And so we organized then from there a meeting of all these leaders of free software projects. Many of them didn't know each other. And as we talked about free software, we realized there were some problems with the names, and we actually discussed and voted on a new name, open source software. And so that was a great example of how bringing people together and then telling a story about it. And we told a very different story than the old free software story that Richard Stallman had told about how software ought to be free, it's a moral obligation. We said, no, there's this practical thing that's happening. The internet runs on free software. There's all these really useful, powerful tools. There's something happening here, and we gave it a new name to make it more respectable. So then a few years later, there was after the dot-com bust, everybody was saying, oh, the web, the internet, it's over as a business model. And again, we saw something new happening. we saw that there were all these new companies, as well as the companies that had really survived the dot-com bust. They all had something in common. There was a new paradigm for the entire software industry. And again, we told a story about it. The name we gave it was Web 2.0. And the idea was that we're shifting from the era of...
So you actually were the creator of that name?
Well, actually, it's not as history often is, it's never quite that simple. It was actually created by Dale Doherty, who's a guy who's been my partner at O'Reilly for 25 years. Dale was brainstorming the idea for some kind of new conference about the renaissance of the web, the second coming of the web. So he actually came up with the name, but it was then wrapped around these ideas that I'd actually been talking about often with the open source software community, because what I was trying to get them to recognize was that even though sites like Google were built on top of Linux, that they were, this didn't mean that Linux was going to take over the world, because what we were seeing was the emergence of some new kind of paradigm in these sites. And so in a lot of ways, Web 2.0 was, my answer to what I'd been talking about already with the open source community. It was saying, look, we're starting to build this internet operating system in which there are data subsystems, if you like, things like search, or now we see the social graph, or location, which are actually databases that get better through network effects. They get better the more people use them. And that's really the heart of what I meant by Web 2.0. It's not about just using social media or lightweight applications with advertising. It's literally about services that get better through contribution. And the key point, though, is that we're nowhere near done with that process. And an example that I give, I think that I think illustrates where we're headed in this Web 2.0 world is the Google mobile app for the iPhone. I don't know if you've actually seen that app. Do I have my phone in my pocket? I probably do. But when you do a search, first of all, there's some amazing things happening here in technology. Actually, let me back up a little bit. The very first thing that shows up here is there's a whole lot of new sensors in this device, the touch screen and so on. But they're also using these sensors as input to databases that live in the cloud, on the internet, if you think about it. So here I am, I'm using the Google mobile app for search, and I pick it up. First of all, the sensor just notices I'm moving it to my ear. It goes into speech recognition mode, so a whole new set of UI things. But where it gets really interesting now, let's say I decide I want to search for pizza, or let's say, in your case, let's say I want to search for tacos, or tortillas, or something, and it does a search, and it's basically, first of all, it hears what I say, it does the speech recognition in the cloud. You couldn't do that speech recognition on the phone. It's happening up in the cloud. And that speech recognition is getting better the more people are saying words in different languages, different accents, so
How
on.
do you explain that? Why it is getting better if more people are using it?
Because that's really what companies have figured out, is that if you can apply these sophisticated algorithms, machine learning techniques,
Okay.
and so they're doing the analysis of enormous amounts of data. And so my point was that that's the new secret of lock-in, because if you have enough data, then other people can't compete with you. So this is why I was saying to the open source guys, hey, you got to watch out, because you can have, a Google or a Facebook can be using Linux all you like, but their lock-in on the customer is in their data, not in their software.
That's where the asset specificity
The asset is the social graph.
Claro.
For Facebook or for Twitter. The asset for Google is this huge database they've made of all the data, not just of all the websites in their index, but, for example, they keep clickstream data. What did people click on? So they've actually built a system that's learning constantly from its users. And so I think we're really moving in the direction of a kind of intelligent system.
Exactly.
It's a little bit like, what Ray Kurzweil has talked about. We are heading in some ways, I think, towards something that may not be an artificial intelligence as often imagined, but it's certainly becoming smarter all the time.
That's incredible. And I mean, as I can see, you have a brain that never rests, and that you can figure out like a good inspector. You know, here is this thing, but here is this need, and here is the whole picture.
Yeah.
And now we will produce this because I mean, you have done so many books and you have gathered so much different information from different parts that at the end helps a lot for the future and the present. Is there like a secret? I don't know how to make this question, but I mean, what? I think it's part of your nature, of
Yeah.
course. But is there like a methodology, or if there is like a moment of inspiration, or
Yeah.
what?
Well, I would say the first thing I do, I use this phrase, watching the alpha geeks.
Okay.
Okay, there are people who are, going back to that William Gibson quote, who are living in the future. And we all know them. We don't often pay enough attention to them. There's
Right.
always somebody, who there's a crowd gathered around, if they're showing off their technology, or they're just the cool people who seem to know things that other people don't know. And in fact, Arthur C. Clarke once said, a sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And there are always people with any technology who appear to be able to do magic, and you say, how did you do that? And so first of all, I just have a sensitivity to that. When I see something that seems really remarkable, I pay attention to it. So then the second thing I do is I just kind of file those things away. I don't try to think too much about them. But I found, and then bit by bit, they start to emerge into a pattern. So it's a lot of it is you assemble the pieces and you kind of go, oh, those things kind of go together. So another thing that we're really involved in right now, we launched a magazine about 5 years ago called Make, which is basically about hardware hacking. Now, hardware hacking was big back in the, around the days of the Homebrew Computer Club in the early 80s, and we just noticed that it was happening again. We didn't know why, we didn't, but so we just started paying attention. We started saying, wow, there's more stories going by about people who are doing interesting things. Here's somebody playing with robotics, or here's somebody who's a great one, a woman at New York University who built something called botanicals, where she put a moisture sensor in her plants. She hooked it up to an open source phone server, and her plants would call her mobile phone when they needed to be watered.
Wow.
And you kind of go, how crazy is that? That's again one of these, somebody's doing this magic, and we just sit there and we say, well,
pay attention. That's
yes, just paying attention. What does that mean? It means, one hand, it means that sensors are becoming more ubiquitous. So we were paying attention to new uses of sensors. Secondly, sensors plus the internet lead to new applications. And the third thing was just the sheer fact that as we saw more and more of these stories, that there were more and more people like Katie London, we said, oh, there's a whole movement happening. So we decided to launch a magazine, which gives us an excuse to feature all these people, talk to them, cover them. And then we launched an event called Maker Fair, which is kind of like a county fair with robots. And we had 80,000 people at the last one.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's a lot of it is just learning to listen and learning to pay attention, but not too closely.
And it is fantastic because you live in the renaissance in many ways of this century, of this, probably not of this century, probably it's a new renaissance that we're having, discovering and inventing and creating. And we're in the future, but there is a future of the future.
Yeah.
Which are, do you think, the most important challenges, also probably in property law, in technological matters, in bioethical or technological ethical questions that you think that we will face in the near future?
I think the biggest challenge we have is around energy, without question.
Could you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, there's really, the story from Homer, from the Odyssey of Scylla and Charybdis, where Odysseus had to sail between these two monsters. Well, we have two monsters. One of them is peak oil. The fact is we have used a great deal of